In a cool world, full of cruel things. Part 2 of the Show Me Hope Again series by Anathemis on Archive of Our Own. Summary. 2 weeks since the first incident has passed, and now, every student in the class had called him Dad at least once. All but one. Shoji Mezzo. Or, Aizawa Shota realizing he doesn't know everything about every kid in his class. Before we get into the story, I'd like to preface this video with a trigger warning. This story contains elements of child abuse. If this is potentially triggering, please proceed with caution or click off of the video entirely. Aizawa Shota was, primarily, an underground hero going by the name Eraserhead. Second to that, he was a father, husband, and homeroom teacher to Class 1A, 2A, although some may argue the former and latter are the same these days. Class 2A, formerly 1A, was the first class ever that Shota can admit to actually liking. Sure, there were some days that he wanted nothing more than to curl up in his sleeping bag and let Yayarozu or Ida teach, especially when excitements were running high, like a storm causing Kaminari's quirk to activate randomly, or Bakugo and the problem child fighting more than usual. The days passed, however, relatively peacefully. Now that Mina and Yuga had help with revision, Kaminari received his ADHD diagnosis, and everyone else had greatly improved. No one was failing in either physical or written exams. Shota, even if he had loathed to admit it, was proud of his class. They'd already been through much more than most up-and-coming hero students, or even current heroes. The class, from what he'd heard through the grapevine, doted on Shota, even going as far as to see him as their father. At the time, he inwardly chuckled, passing it off as hearsay, knowing most students were intimidated by his tired look and no-nonsense demeanor. It wasn't until about a month into their second year, however, when Shota realized just how much of an impact this class might have had on him. On a bright, relatively cloudless morning, Shota and Present Mike were overwatching Class 2A's quirk development on their ultimate moves. So far, Bakugo's AP shot had near 100% accuracy and usefulness. Midoriya's ability to use more of his quirk was growing from 20% to nearly 50%, a lengthy battle that Shota was sure to leave to Yagi. And Kaminari had increased his max number of volts, slowly but surely. There wasn't much involvement on Shota or Present Mike's part. His students, were pretty independent and clever when it came to utilizing their quirks these days, meaning Shota just had to make sure no one overdid it, or were somehow able to injure themselves. He definitely wasn't looking at Problem Child when he said that. Suddenly, he heard a calamity from Kaminari's side of the large arena and quickly jogged over. Present Mike was just behind him, but Shota would be needed to cancel out his quirk, if necessary. When he got close, he activated his quirk, gripping his capture weapon with his other hand. You can't be too careful these days, especially with how often this class alone was targeted by the League of Villains. The cancellation of Kaminari's quirk worked, though, and he dropped the battery in his hand, his yelling quieting down to a cry. His yellow flashes of electricity stopped eventually, body calmed. His student slumped to the floor in a heap, and Shota approached him, his name on his lips, worry overtaking him. I'm okay, just overdid it, Sensei, Kaminari muttered, disappointment evident on his face. He got to his knees, took a deep breath, and took Shota's offered hand to pull him to his feet. Alright, just be careful, Kaminari, Shota replied gruffly, deactivating his quirk after seeing that his student was okay and turning on his foot. Kaminari smiled a bit, shaking himself off. Thanks, Dad. Sensei! Shota froze in his place, back turned to Kaminari, facing Present Mike, barely able to breathe. Did he just hear that? Shaking his head and ignoring his husband's gleeful giggling, he sighed and continued walking to the front of the arena. Well, that was a thing that just happened, and now he was going to pretend that it didn't. On his way back, he heard Kaminari and Kirishima muttering between themselves, the odd laugh bellowing across the arena. Dude, did you just call Aizawa-sensei Dad? Shut up, bro! I swear I didn't! It just slipped out! A few guffaws later, they had finally parted and returned to their respective areas. Fuck, that probably wasn't going to stay quiet for very long, especially now that Kirishima knew. Soon, Sero would, and Bakugo would, who would probably tell Mina, who would tell Yagirozu and Hagakure, and Ojiro, and then the whole class would know. Damn. They've gone from being scared of you to calling you Dad! Present Mike laughed again, practically loud enough for everyone to hear, ignoring Shota's heavy glare. I'll admit, I'm a bit jealous, he said, before giggling again. Fuck off, it doesn't matter, Shota whisper-shouted, turning his eyes back to his class. Whatever, he doesn't care. Not a single iota. Nope. Fuck. Less than a week later, the dad situation was growing. After Kaminari called him Dad accidentally, the news spread around the rest of the class like wildfire. Shinso, already under his care, didn't really care, along with Eri, both of whom already called him their father occasionally. It definitely didn't stop Kirishima jokingly calling him Dad when he passed him on the way out of class. Nor did it stop Hagakure calling him Dad when he walked into the dorms that night. Even Kaminari had said it a few times since then. Mostly jokes, although infused with something else underneath that Shota couldn't identify. Nezu had called him into his office after a few days, mentioning it offhandedly, something about the other teachers having picked up on it. Shota cursed that it managed to get back to the principal, not exactly sure why he was disappointed. It definitely didn't have anything to do with the warmth that spread in his chest when anyone in his class called him Dad, joking or not. Would you like for us staff to ask them to stop? Sipping on his tea slowly, Shota thought about it. Did he want them to stop? He thought about it for a minute or two, reminding himself of how each and every single one of the students in Class 2A had nightmares or PTSD of some kind, knowing seriously that this was the least of their problems. If they needed someone to call their dad, who was he to say otherwise? And if he liked it, well, that was just for him to know, wasn't it? No, thank you, he said, blatantly ignoring the knowing grin on the animal-cross-human in front of him, and stood, gently placing his teacup on the table. Is there anything else you need? No, Aizawa, thank you for coming in. With that, he turned around and left, hiding a chuckle into his scarf. It wouldn't do for his reputation to completely disintegrate, even if he himself knew how much he'd changed in the last year, and a bit as a result of this damned class. 2 weeks since the first incident had passed, and now, every student in the class had called him Dad at least once. All but one. Shoji Mezzo. Even Koda had called him Dad, admittedly using sign language, but that wasn't important. Bakugo had been the last one, but clearly, the rest of the class had wanted him to do so, not making a big deal out of it. None of them made a big thing about it, to be honest. They were small incidents, such as when he handed them something in class, or taught them some new hand-to-hand combat techniques individually. One even called him Dad when he agreed to a weekend outing, after watching him sign the permission slip with little hesitance. It was an unspoken agreement amongst both Class 2A and the teachers. Once they saw that he didn't care, they left it untouched, more or less. His kids, students, didn't always call him Dad. Mostly it was Sensei or Aizawa, with the odd Dad thrown in. At least once a day, by someone, however. He hated admitting that he missed it when he didn't get called Dad. When Shota was young and finally realizing his preference for the same sex, he'd foregone any thoughts of children, claiming to not want any or even liking them. He wasn't even good with kids. At least, he thought he wasn't. He thought he was unlovable and cold-hearted, too, but everyone knows how wrong he was about that. Maybe this kid thing was just another thing he was wrong about, he rationalized, after having to calm his racing heart when Todoroki called him Dad one night, after carrying the sleepy teen to his bed. Weekly moving nights in the Class 2A dorm was one of Shota's favorite times of the week, especially when the big three, Eri, and his husband joined in. He knew, inside, how much of a softie he'd become, But he was so much happier now than he was even a year ago that he didn't think about it too much. Just one of those things, he thought. So when he noticed that every student in his class had called him Dad, except Shoji, his mind almost hyper-focused on it. For students like Todoroki, Ojiro, and Bakugo to call him Dad before Shoji, that left something to be said. Sure, he felt closer to the tall teen after last year's mishap with his mask, but probably not close enough to ask why he'd never called him Dad. Instead, he just thought about it, probably a lot more than he should for someone with as many responsibilities as he did. He thought about what Shoji was like. Quiet, but kind. Approachable. Clever in both mind and common sense. Strong with his quirk and without it. Caring when it came to his classmates. And who he was friends with. Tokoyami and Dark Shadow were probably his closest friends, Ojiro and Hagakure following, then the rest of the class in no particular order. And his past. Mostly unknown, except the fact that he was bullied for his looks and mutations as a result of his quirk. His outward demeanor. Unmaterialistic as hell, considering the lack of furniture in his room, thick-skinned and protective. Ironically, he was the tallest in the class, and yet the youngest, which is something to be noted, considering his high levels of maturity. To Shota, Shoji was an overall good kid, kind at heart, and easily a top 20 aspiring hero. The answer came to Shota one day, in the middle of a mindless task in the house, like a punch to the face. Shota had never actually met Shoji's family. In fact, no one had. On the day that he and Yagi visited each household to ask for permission for their students to move into the UA dorms, Shoji's name wasn't on the list. Instead, a phone call was arranged. It was a quick call, in the end. He spoke to a woman briefly, of whom sounded very nice, but it didn't go unnoticed that she referred to Shoji as Shoji, a level of unfamiliarity that struck Shota as unusual at the time. Don't mothers call their children by their given name? What was Shoji's family like? Maybe he could devise a plan to ask him about it, in a way that didn't seem suspicious. Checking Shoji's folder in the school archive revealed a dismal lack of familial information. No known contact for his mother or father, just a phone number and the words, Musutafu Orphanage. Well, there it was. He didn't actually have a family. That was it, then. Shota would ask Shoji about some missing information in his school folder. 3 days later, his chance finally came. Most of the class were going out, considering it was a bright Saturday, but a few were staying behind, namely Tokoyami, Shoji, and Koda. They were the quiet ones, preferring the quiet of the dorms, and Shota wholeheartedly agreed. Class 2A was a boisterous and obnoxious bunch at the best of times, and even he needed a break from their enthusiasm sometimes. It was just turning noon when he made his way to the 2A dorms, meaning the rest wouldn't be back for a few hours. Koda, comfortable with the lack of noise for once, had brought Yue-chan downstairs for a bit, content to watch her play with a few toys, Tokoyami looking on with joy. She was a peaceful bunny, not destructive or loud, and Shota made sure to give her a gentle pat on his way through the dorms, nodding to the 2 students on the couch. He knew he shouldn't have favorites, but the quiet ones were the best to get along with, in Shota's opinion. He punched in the floor for Shoji's room in the elevator, remembering the last time he was there as the time he went to get his capture weapon back from Shoji last year. He wouldn't admit it to anyone, but he felt the beginnings of nervousness in his stomach, knowing that this could go either way. It could push Shoji away entirely and ruin any chance he had of getting to know him better, or it would answer Shota's questions and allow him to accept Shoji into the fold of 2A entirely. He stepped out of the elevator, sighing heavily, folder clutched to his chest. Then, he resolutely knocked on Shoji's door. "Come in," Shoji replied, allowing Shota to slowly push open the door. His room, still, was pretty bare, especially in comparison to Kirishima's or even Tokoyami's rooms. It did, however, show the beginnings of fondness, Some pictures were pinned up on the wall in front of his desk, mainly of himself in the class, but a few of his friends without. Yue-chan was probably on there the most, and Shota smiled, glad that his student finally felt comfortable enough to gather at least a few personal items. There was the odd trinket too, like a small crow statue on his desk, a poster or two with some heroes on it, even a small collection of chains and necklaces, probably Tokoyami's gothic influence. Shoji was sat at his desk currently, textbook open on one side and homework on the other. Shota shook his head fondly, proud but still a little sad that this was the way his student would spend his weekend. But if that's the way he relaxed, who was Shota to judge him? Shoji looked up from the textbook, clearly surprised to see Shota in the doorway, and stood from his chair, bowing slightly. "Sensei, what brings you here?" Shota hated that he felt some irritation at the formal way his student spoke to him, wishing more than anything that he felt more comfortable in his presence. I mean, fuck, he wasn't gonna force him against a wall and shoot him if he let the facade drop a little. Even Ida managed it, most days, but having grown up with Tensei and practically babysitting Tenya when he was a toddler, it felt natural these days. On Shoji, who he knew could joke around with friends and even be sarcastic, it felt almost too forced. "Relax, kid. There's nothing wrong." Shota gestured for him to sit down again, closing the door behind him and pulling up the folder so that Shoji could see his name on it. "There's just some information missing, and I'm wondering why it's taken over a year for the staff to notice." If Shota saw how Shoji flinched at that, he deigned not to mention it, and instead sat against the door, crossing his legs, determined to introduce some informality into the situation. He flicked the folder open to the contacts section, spinning it around so Shoji could read it, or, should he say, read what wasn't there. Shota let it sit for a moment, catching the way that Shoji gulped, hands tightening into fists. "Why didn't we know you were in an orphanage, Shoji?" Shota prided himself on the way his voice remained steady, despite the worry that he felt. "I asked for it to remain unnoticed," Shoji replied, voice remarkably calm even if his body language showed otherwise. One hand reached up to fiddle with the mask around his neck, currently not over his face, as if it was a nervous habit. Shota sighed, knowing that would be the answer. "Why would you do that?" He knew what a calm and rational student Shoji was, knowing there was no point in taking the long way around the conversation. This felt weirdly familiar to the conversation they shared last year, actually. "It's unimportant, Sensei. Hitoshi was in care too." "If you know that Hitoshi was in care too, you know how important it is for the staff to know these things. I'm not trying to make you feel like you've done something wrong, Shoji. I just want to know that you know we aren't heartless. If you were happy and comfortable, we wouldn't press, but something tells me that you aren't." Shoji shook his head slightly, eyes closing tight. "I'm fine, Sensei," he replied through gritted teeth. Shota nodded, reaching over and grabbing the folder again, closing it and standing up. "All right," he said, slowly. "If you say so." With that, he opened the door, tucked the folder under his arm, and left the room, a knowing look on his face. "Wait!" There it was. He opened the door again, looking Shoji in the eyes. "I'll tell you everything, but please don't tell anyone else." Shota walked into the room again, closing the door and sitting against it for the second time. "I can't promise that, Shoji. If you're being hurt in any way, I'll breach safeguarding protocols by not telling anyone, making me liable to be fired." Shoji winced at that, before nodding. He stood from his chair, slowly sitting in front of Shota, mimicking his position. "My parents died when I was 10, Shoji began, giving the information that Shota expected, before taking a deep breath. "They were not very good parents, from what I understand. My father used to hurt me, especially because of my appearance, and my mother was verbally abusive." This was news to Shota. He nodded slowly, gesturing for him to continue. They taught me to be obedient, often taking away my toys and food if I broke their rules. People said they were immature and didn't know how to look after me, whilst others agreed with what they did, saying it was punishment for how I look. I didn't really know what to believe. I remember telling my teachers, but none of them believed me. Most of them were scared of me. They died in a car crash when I was 10, on the way home. My father was driving drunk, although both of them were under the influence. I don't hate my parents, Sensei. I don't love them either, though. Musutafu took me in afterwards. Shota nodded at the last statement, but his brow furrowed more and more throughout Shoji's words. It wasn't at all what he had expected, to be honest. Or maybe he knew, but didn't want to realize it, or associate Shoji's excessive quietness and obedience to something like abuse. How does Musutafu treat you? Well enough, Shoji quipped. They don't care much for the older kids, catering towards the younger ones with more manageable quirks. He said bitterly, some hidden contempt there. I want you to realize that if we knew, we would have taken you in as a ward of the school, meaning you'd stay here during the summer, either in the dorms or with one of the teachers. Is that something you'd want to happen? Shoji clearly thought over it for a moment before deciding. Yes, as long as it's no trouble, yes, I would. Whilst I'm grateful that Musutafu gave me a home, they aren't home. Shota tilted his head in confusion for a moment. Where is home to you, Shoji? Shoji blinked, clearly in surprise that he had picked up on it before a slight blush rose to his cheeks. Here, Sensei. I consider this class my family, and UA as my home. I have never felt more welcome and comfortable than I do whilst I'm here. Shota's poor heart practically soared at that statement, and he hid a bright grin into his scarf, pride and love flowing in his body. Maybe he's not so bad at looking after 20 equally confusing and broken kids as he'd originally thought. Did you ever receive therapy for what happened to you? He knew the stigma around therapy, but the knowledge that Bakugo, Todoroki, and Ida had attended or were still attending therapy helped a few others gain the confidence to do so, and maybe the same would happen here. Shoji shook his head, rubbing a sheepish hand over the back of his neck. They never offered it, but I wouldn't have taken it even if they did. I thought I deserved what happened to me, to be honest. I made kids cry with my appearance all the time, and my mother manipulated me into believing that I was unlovable and evil. Shota, for a moment, felt his heart shatter a little bit, a sense of familiarity coming to mind. I was told I was unlovable too, but now I have what feels like 100 kids and a husband. Shota replied dryly. Shoji grinned a little, thankfully. What, is Dad finally getting to you? He asked, just as sarcastically as Shota knew he could. Oi, he said, letting Shoji see that he was smiling. The opposite, more like. That surprised Shoji a little. You like it when they call you Dad? Shota nodded, ignoring the blush he knew Shoji could see. It's ridiculous, I know, but there you go. Shoji laughed quietly and Shota grinned again, knowing he wasn't being judged for his affections. Would you be open to therapy with Hound Dog? I know you may feel like you don't need it anymore, but it's never too late to go to therapy for untreated trauma, no matter your age. Shoji nodded, pretty quick to accept, not surprising Shota in the slightest. As he said, Shoji was a clever and mature kid. Does anyone else know? Tokoyami knows a little, even going as far as to threaten to raise them from the dead in his typical goetic nature to let Dark Shadow loose on them, but I dissuaded him from that after a while. Shoji replied, blushing again. That's pretty cute, Shota thought before shaking his head. you aren't monstrous or dangerous, Shoji. In fact, you're one of the kindest and gentlest kids in this class, despite being the tallest and one of the strongest. I don't know anyone that thinks badly of you, teacher or student. Shota reached out and put a weathered and achy hand on Shoji's shoulder. I know this class likes calling me Dad as a joke, but I want you to know that you shouldn't feel uncomfortable if you ever feel the urge to do so. The students of 2A are some of the most broken and sad of any class in the school, and if it helps them even slightly, they can see me as whatever they need to, father or otherwise. I don't even care if it goes against societal or UA standards. You kids have more than earned the right, in my eyes. Shoji nodded, still blushing. I don't know if I'd ever be comfortable calling you Dad, especially as it's mostly associated with pain and sadness, but I still want to thank you. You've done more for me than any adult has ever done. Shota thought for a moment, then nodded. Alright, then you may call me Shota. I want you kids to feel comfortable, and at least view UA and the dorms as a safe space. I might be your homeroom teacher, Shoji, but I'd like to think you're one of my many adopted sons, too. Shota knew Present Mike would be cooing at him with hard eyes if he was here, but he banished that thought immediately. Fuck Mike. He loved these kids as much as he did. Thank you, Shota, Shoji said, very softly. Shota didn't mention the tears in his eyes and merely opened the folder again, flipping to the contacts page, and wrote his own number down next to his name. He closed it again, stood up, and offered a hand to Shoji. He could probably get up himself, he thought, a bit dryly, but followed through with it and tugged Shoji to his feet. Thanks, kid, he said, opening the door and taking his leave, content with what he'd been told. Next on his to-do list was to contact Hound Dog and Musatafu Orphanage, and then tell Mike that they had yet another kid to look after. He shook his head fondly, stroking Yue-chan on the way out, nodding to Tokoyami and Koda on the couch, still basking in the blissful silence. That Monday, in class, Shota went around the room handing out a few slips of paper to Class 2A. He received a few "Thanks, Dad" in return, none of which were a surprise, but it still made him stumble a little. A few "Thank you, senseis," and from Shoji, a "Thank you, Shota." When 19 heads whipped around to look at Shoji in surprise and whispers broke out, Shota merely grinned into his scarf, that warmth in his heart returning. Shoji paid no mind to any of the questions being thrown his way, exchanging a small happy glance with Shota, and began reading the sheet. To say Shota was proud of his class was an understatement. It was probably a little unconventional, their attachments to both each other and their teacher, but Shota didn't care one bit. He had more pressing matters to attend, like getting mandatory screenings for every student entering UA. Hello everyone, this is IcarusAudios, and I hope you enjoyed this story as much as I did. This was part 2 of the Show Me Hope Again series, which I will be continuing in the future. You can find Anathemis on Archive of Our Own, or through the link in the description. If you like the content and want more in the future, click the subscribe button to be notified when a new podfic comes out. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.